Mhm.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, Am Nemo, and our guest today is Kamala Cesar. Hello, welcome.
Right.
So, Kamala is a disciple of Balasaraswati, is a specialist in Natyam, South Indian dance, in the style of Balasaraswati. She was born in Brooklyn, New York, and is Native American from the Mohawk Tribe and Filipino. She studied the classical dance of South India, both in the United States and in India. She is the founder and artistic director of Lotus Music and Dance, a not for profit organization. So we're this is in honor of Native American Heritage Month. We are so happy. I'm pleased that you have the opportunity, the time to come and join us today and to share this interesting background and all the things that you're involved with. To start with, please tell us about your childhood, where you grew up, and how it felt being part Native American, part Filipino.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and my mother was from the Mohawk Tribe, from the Akwesasne Reservation, which is on the border of New York State and Canada. And my father came from the Philippines. He was from the island of Panay, which is in more southern part of Philippines, and that's where my mother met my father. She had an interesting situation where she was one of these Native Americans that was put in a boarding school when she was very young. And so she spent most of her life in this boarding school run by the Jesuits in Canada. And when she left the school after high school, in these boarding schools, they were not allowed to speak the language, and they were punished if, for doing anything that was Indian. So she pretty much grew up being ashamed of being Native American. So when she went back to the reservation, because she didn't speak Mohawk anymore, she couldn't communicate with her own family. And it was a very difficult, situation for her. And since she had been educated and, like she was actually sent to teach on a reserve in some remote place in Canada, but she didn't like the location where it was. So she had a cousin who was Mohawk who left the reservation and moved to, the New York City area and was married to a Filipino. And so when she contacted her cousin and got, names of people that could help her, she moved to New York City and was introduced to the Filipino community because of that connection. And so that's how it all started. So we grew up in Brooklyn until
Oh,
I was until I was 8 in the third grade, and then we moved to South Jersey. But
okay, so you told us a little bit of how she was raised, given that she had to like not speak her language, and that she and the school that she was in. But tell us a little bit about the Mohawk tribe and how did that situation end up where it was?
well, I didn't know I was Mohawk. She didn't tell us we were Mohawk until I was in high school. So I grew up thinking I was half French Canadian and half Filipino because she was born on the French Canadian side of the reservation. She considered herself French Canadian. So this is a little, crazy because I really didn't know very much about, the Mohawk tribe until after I left home and kind of started, looking into like what does it mean to be Mohawk. So by that time, I was living in California and I was going to college, and um, there aren't any Mohawks, not very many Mohawks in California because it's so far away from where they're originally from. But when I came back to New York um, after having studied and gone to school in California, studied Indian dance, and gone to India, and I moved back to New York, my mother would come back from because my family had by then moved out to California and they were all in Berkeley. and she wanted to come back and visit the family that was still on the reservation. So I would go with her up to the reservation, which was at that time the only way to get there was like an 8-hour bus ride from Port Authority, New York, to up there to Akwesasne. And so we would go and we would visit the remaining family members she had on the reservation. Now they were all converted to Christianity, so we grew up and we were raised Catholic, because also in the Philippines, on the Filipino side, the Spanish influence in the Philippines was, they brought Christianity, and it's a very Catholic country also. So I was basically raised Catholic. And so when I went back to the reservation with my mother and was visiting her family members, I was asking her, her youngest brother was married to a very traditional Mohawk woman whose father was a chief in the Longhouse. And so I started asking her, what was that all about? What is the Mohawk, culture all about? And so she introduced me to Tom Porter, Sago Gwinyunquist, who was a sub chief in the Longhouse. And I started learning about how there's this big divide on the reservation where there are the traditional Longhouse people, and then there are the Christian, the Native people who were converted to Christianity. And then there were the people who were being sort of influenced by the government to become more, have a more democratic government. So there are these factions on the reservation where there's the Longhouse traditional people who feel that they already know how to govern themselves. And then there are the Native people who are trying to be more democratic and having, the kinds of elections, according to a democratic process. And then, and they're like constantly at odds with each other. And so to understand, like, the Mohawk people, they're part of a confederacy. So there are 6 nations that are part of the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, which is how they refer to themselves, the people of the Longhouse. And how many hundreds, thousands of years ago, there was this story, or the myth, that the peacemaker, all these tribes were fighting with each other, and the Mohawks were fighting against the Onondaga and the Senecas, and evidently there was a peacemaker who came who said they had to stop fighting. And there's a whole epic story that they tell in the Longhouse that tells how the peacemaker came and went to each of the tribes and explained that they needed to stop fighting and to work together and to form this confederacy, or this union where they all had decided how they were going to live together. And that story, it's called the Peacemaker's Journey, is told in the Longhouse every year. But because it takes 55 hours to tell the story, it goes from one nation. They take turns telling the story. And the story basically it's sort of like, the Bible in a way, because it really is filled with all kinds of morality stories and ethics, and how to conduct oneself as a human being, and the importance of family. And this story, because it's told in the language of that nation in the Longhouse, a lot of people today don't speak their native languages, because of this whole boarding school issue and people not being allowed to speak their language. A lot of people don't speak their native languages. And so this elder that I had met through my aunt, Tom Porter, when I started, talking to him and finding out more about the Longhouse tradition, he came to me one time and said, if you want to do a project, maybe you should tell the story of the Peacemaker's Journey through dance. And so that was one of the things that happened, like as a result of that connection. We did a production called the Peacemaker's Journey, and told some of this. We couldn't tell all of the stories in a 2-hour production, but we kind of chose the most important points of the story, and how the Confederacy was formed, and how it's a matriarchal society, and the women, choose the leaders, and all of the history of the Iroquois Confederacy.
Did you say that you did the story through dance? Is that
Yeah,
what you said? Okay. And was that through the Bharata dance?
it was actually through, no, it was more through Native American and Filipino, and there was, I think, another group that was involved, but it was mainly trying to tell it through a combination of narrative and dance. So there was like, yeah, there was mostly, we tried to do it mostly through, indigenous dance. Although there
And
was a ballet dancer, and he was actually an indigenous from Venezuela, but we had met him through the dance theater Harlem, and he was so interested in native, the Native American storytelling idea that he was in the production too. So it was kind of like a collaboration, a collaborative effort with different cultures trying to tell a story.
and I think you said that the peacemaker's journey is only in the tribal's language. It wasn't never translated. Is there a way that people can like read about it, or how has it stayed alive?
Well, now that Tom Porter recited the whole story for us, we have it. We have the audio.
Okay, okay, great. Because my thing was like, oh, then how is it staying alive? So now you have an audio of it. You just have
Yeah,
a different way of telling it.
yeah,
Wonderful, wonderful.
yeah.
Okay. Um, so that's a beautiful history, and I'm like very curious. 55 hours, but it sounds like it would be worth reading it. And I was thinking when you were saying about this peacemaker, I was like, well, is this peacemaker still alive? And can we take those teachings and then kind of the world really needs that kind of a person right now where they just come. The message seems simple, right? We all want that, but for whatever reason, we are human beings have kind of complicated things. But how has, you shared a lot about your the tribe, the Mohawk tribe, and how was the Filipino influence in your life and in your work and
It's
all
really
that?
interesting because like I said about my father, while he I don't think he practiced being Catholic. He kind of raised us Catholic because at the time in the Philippines, all of the influence of the Spanish and then the Americans kind of influenced how we were raised. And while growing up, he didn't speak Tagalog to us. He spoke Tagalog to his friends, and he had many Filipino friends who would come and visit, and so there was so much more connection to the Filipino side than to the Mohawk side because we were not living on the reservation, and there weren't very many Mohawks in Brooklyn that we knew, and so I would say that I was more influenced by my father's side, although the actual culture was not really evident. Like we didn't do Filipino dances growing up, but we did eat a lot of Filipino food because my father was a gourmet cook, and he used to make like all the dishes that were from his from the Filipino side. But what was interesting for me was when I started, because of my dance background and because I was able to start this organization once I was in New York. One of the first other dancers that I met was a Filipino dancer who wanted to teach at our center, and she did dances from Mindanao. Mindanao is the southernmost island in the Philippines, and it's one of I think the only places where indigenous people like were not kind of converted by outsiders and influenced by outside culture, and so they've maintained their culture. And so she does these indigenous dances from the Philippines. And because I was Mohawk, she always felt a strong connection because of the Native American connection. And so, what I learned about the Philippines is that there is this whole like indigenous culture that exists that nobody knows much about, except now due to Potri Rankamanes and her company. She has now a company that's celebrating 30 years of doing their dances and preserving their culture and their language. And it's amazing. It's quite extraordinary. And I think, I feel a strong connection to her, and what she's doing because of also my background. But through the dance, she's been able to really, keep this alive and this tradition strong.
So you mentioned, we talked a little bit about this before the interview about the Harati dance, the South Indian dance. Tell us a little bit about that and how you ended up interested in it and getting, how did you get involved, basically? But the history is so fascinating, I found.
Yeah. Well, when I went to California to go to college, in order to take advantage of the free educational system, you had to be a resident. So I had to establish residency first. So I took like a year off to do that. And while I was sort of waiting, I became involved in a theater group, and it was through this theater group that I was in, exposed to so many different cultures, because the leader of the group, who was a poet, was doing these plays, this idea, and it was kind of like an experimental idea of um, making it more of a communal kind of experience. So everyone was invited to join. You didn't have to have any training, but many artists and many people with talents and skills showed up and wanted to be part of this theater group, and they were basically really the center of the play was about a spiritual journey, and it was about understanding, like, what why are we here, what are we doing, what is the meaning of all of our life. And again, at the time, it was during the big war protests because of the war in Vietnam, and there was a lot of discussion about, like, what is this war, what does it mean to be in the middle of a war with another country. And so it was all of these things in this play that we were doing. And the dance was kind of like whatever, however you felt like moving, whatever inspired you however you were inspired to express yourself, was fine. So it was kind of an interesting experience, because I had no experience in the arts, no experience in dance or movement or any of this, and it just opened up a whole new world, that, oh, this is another form of expression that anyone can do. And so he had these dancers who came and worked with us just to teach us basic movement exercises and how to, like, do warm-up exercises for your voice and so on. And one of the people was this ballet dancer, and she had gone to UCLA and taken a summer workshop with Balasaraswati. And when she came back after that summer session, she was telling everyone that this was the most extraordinary dance form she'd ever experienced, that it was very much like what we were doing in the theater group, that it was music and dance and poetry and storytelling all combined into one dance form. And she'd never seen anything like it. And she was raving about this dance form. And she said, oh, and by the way, um, Balasaraswati has a disciple who teaches in Berkeley. And so she said, she encouraged us all to check it out. And which I did. When the theater company disbanded, I went and started taking lessons. And it was the first dance class I'd ever taken in my life. I had no idea what I was doing. I had never seen Bharata Natyam. But the process, the learning process was so extraordinary for me. I was very interested at the time in meditation, and I was also learning about Zen meditation. And when I went to these classes, I felt very much like I did after meditating, for like 40 minutes. I'd come out of the class and I would be like, no matter how exhausted I was or how tired I was, if I took the class, I came out feeling totally like, a new person. And so because of that part of it, that experience, I just kept going back. It was a year before I saw my teacher, who I was learning with, perform the dance form. She did a concert. It's a solo dance form. And this one person dances for 2 hours and does these extraordinary things. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like, They use hand gestures, a very complex system of hand gestures and rhythmic footwork. And you're constantly moving and focusing on your hands. And then it's storytelling, and you're expressing ideas and emotions. And I didn't understand anything about what she was dancing, but it was so beautiful to watch. I could not believe how this woman could hold my attention for 2 hours, and I had no idea what she was dancing about. But I thought, this is very powerful. This is a very extraordinary thing to know how to do. And that's when I decided I wanted to go to India and study with her teacher, Balasaraswati. And so I told her, I said, I think I want to go to India. So she said, well, you need to write to her and see if she'll accept you as her student, because in India, there's this whole elaborate guru-shishya relationship where the teacher has to accept the student and so on. And that's how it all started. It was like my experience of seeing someone perform the dance who was outside of the culture. She wasn't Indian, and yet she had learned this extraordinary thing. And so I wrote to Balasaraswati, and I got a letter back saying that I could come, but I would need to stay for 3 years to learn basic foundation and da da da. So I was trying to figure out how to do that, and then she came to Mills College to teach that summer. So I didn't have to go to India.
It came to you.
It was incredible. For the next 2 years, she came.
Well, like they say, when the student is ready, it's just amazing how things come up. I've been in situations where I ended up in a mystical school where it was like I had kids and I had all these things. There was no way I could barely like get to the to the coffee shop or to the bookstore, let alone like travel anywhere for what I needed. And then it just appeared. It's like, oh, well, we're offering this online. And I thought, okay, and this is what that sounds like. So all these experiences, I'm assuming with the dance and your interest in arts and such has led you to create or to establish the Lotus Music and Dance. Was that what was behind it? Tell us a little bit, like when did you when did you establish that? And what was the reason behind that? What motivated you, pushed you to it? And also what does it provide?
Well, I think that after I think it was after I moved to New York City, because my teacher had in one of my meetings with my teacher, she told me that she really wanted me to be to do the dance professionally, that it shouldn't just be a hobby, it should be that I should do it professionally. And when I thought about that, I said, oh, how am I supposed to do that? And I mean, I had no idea. But when I was living in New York, I had all these opportunities started coming up. Like I had a chance to go to Europe, and so I had performed in various places in Europe, and it seemed like every year it was like, well, how do I keep going? How do I keep developing? How do I keep? And so I did go back to India one more time, and that was when my teacher said, I really think that my style should be represented in New York, because that's like the dance capital of the world. And so I said, well, I'm living in New York now, so I can help to do something. And so that was the motivation. Like initially, I started the Balasaraswati School of Music and Dance in New York, and it was mainly to continue this tradition in her style. And at the same time, I met these other two people that were also living in New York. An American disciple of Birju Maharaj, the famous Kathak dancer, the North Indian dance style, and Janaki Patrick, and she was also teaching and performing in New York. And then there was a sitar player who was an American disciple of Ali Akbar Khan, who was based in California, but she had just moved back to New York. And so we kind of formed a small group, and we would do North and South Indian styles of music and dance, and we started doing lecture demonstrations and performances, and all of this just became part of the reality that a lot of these very traditional art forms needed to survive by being seen and by being able to teach classes and pass it on to the next generation. And so it all kind of started from that seed. And in 1990, I was teaching my classes at a studio in New York City that was owned by the famous tap choreographer Henry Latang. I was just renting studio space from his studio. It was like the whole eighth floor in a building on 27th Street, and it was mostly tap classes and tap auditions for Broadway shows because he had choreographed, made sophisticated ladies, Black and Blue, Beauty. I mean, he was a very famous tap choreographer. Anyway, he that's where I was teaching my classes, and we became friends because he would come by my class because he heard all these crazy rhythms coming out of the studio, and he asked me all about Indian dance, and so like after that, when we were planning to bring, well, they actually then by then I had started Lotus Music and Dance to continue like the fact that there were so many people in New York who were doing traditional music and dance who had no place to really teach their classes and to perform. And one summer, Henry Latang, who owned that studio, went out to San Francisco to put up sophisticated ladies, and it took longer than normal, and he didn't come back, and so they were going to close down the studio. And the super came to me one day and said, "Maybe you want to take over the studio because otherwise the landlord's going to close down the place because he hadn't paid the rent." So that's how we took over this. We took over that studio space, and once we had it open and running, just people just showed up. The Filipino dance group, the flamenco dancers. Everybody was looking for space where they could teach their classes.
Well, I'm curious that one of the things that came to mind is that, did the COVID period, I'm sure during that time it was closed, but then were you able to continue afterwards? I mean, did it remain,
Well,
hopefully?
actually, we lost that studio space well before the pandemic during Hurricane Sandy, and it didn't have anything to do with the flood that happened in our studio. But during that Hurricane Sandy, there was a flood from the upstairs space that totally ruined half of the floor that we were on, and it took the landlord almost 8 months to fix the problem. That 8 months had to find other places for our classes and scramble around to keep going. And then when he did repaired the place, he insisted that we pay for the rent during the time that we couldn't use the space. And they said if we weren't going to pay the rent, they weren't going to renew our lease. And obviously we got a lawyer, and they said he can't make you pay the rent for the time that you couldn't occupy the space. So we just we basically had to move out because there was going to be either a lawsuit or whatever, and we weren't going to pay the back rent. So we lost the space in 2013, and we tried continuing the classes using other studios, but it's very difficult to manage being in all these different locations and trying to keep it going. So we basically just did the performances, presenting the performances and doing the arts and education programs that we do in the schools, and focused on presenting. And the classes kind of like, most of our artists teach their classes anyway, regardless of whether we do it. They will teach their classes one way or another, and that's sort of what has happened. Is the classes are still going on, but they're being done individually.
They're being done differently.
Yes,
Yes,
yeah.
that's kind of, yeah, like we've had quite a change because of COVID. So many of our programming went online. And
Right.
actually, that worked out very well because then we were able to reach to different communities. We were more limited before to who we can reach, how we can reach them. So the COVID situation made it seem like, all we did, we just changed the creative and our creative work into just a different platform. And it still worked. We're still doing the same thing. So, but you're still active is what you're saying. You're still active. You're just in a different format.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. In fact, during the pandemic, we did have to cancel our in-person events, but we managed to do them online. So we live streamed the events that we would have normally done.
Right.
So we did keep going. The same thing with the schools. A lot of our artists were able to figure out how to, do a Zoom class with the kids, and everything kept going, but it was so much more work. It just like was.
It's different, right? The technology is great, but it's also different. And there's, and we're all as creatives, though we can always accommodate. We always find ways.
Exactly. Somehow we do. We
We
managed to
do
do
it. So any, last thoughts that you could share with us that we could, for our audience, just a message that you want to leave us with.
Well, now that we have, been doing live streaming, our in-person events now, like we keep, like live streaming them because we've found that more people get to access what we do. So we do have an event online right now, the World Dance Festival, which was Balinese dance, Odissi dance, Kathak, and flamenco is online now, and you can go to our website and access, like the program. We're also, we this year, well, it took 4 years to get this one project underway, but we wanted to tell Gandhi's story through dance, through a kind of collaborative, multicultural effort. And so we presented a work in progress this last a couple Sundays ago, telling Gandhi's story, which I think is also very important for people to remember, what he accomplished through his nonviolent, movement of satyagraha. And we tell the story through dance of what it was that allowed him to become this, hero of his nation to free them from the British. So there's the Gandhi project that we would like to continue to present. And then also this message of peace that we did with the Mohawk, with the about the Iroquois Confederacy. We've been thinking of trying to tell more of the story, maybe through a combination of film and dance. So building on what we were able to accomplish with the dance project to maybe expand it in a narrative film that tells more of the story. And so that's sort of what we're looking into now to go forward with that project.
Where can you said that all this information is available on your website? Can you the website is Lotus Music and Dance
.org. Yeah.
.org. Okay, yeah. So people can find all this
Yeah.
the schedule and everything on Lotus Music and Dance. I'll be one of those visiting that site.
Okay.
This sounds very interesting, especially the telling of the stories. I've heard of it more than following that, but I'm really interested in seeing like the Gandhi story through it and learning more about the peacemaker. You really got me interested in that one. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be following your work, and I'm sure our audience has loved hearing about your background. Thank you.
Thank you, and I definitely will come and visit.
Great. Oh yes, in person. You must do that. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye-bye.